On the first day of this Rotary year, if you were here, you may recall that I said every resource we could ever need as a club is already right here in this room. It's a number of you out there. And another perfect example is Jan Levy. Yes, former executive director of Leadership Tomorrow, who led last year's membership survey, serves on the program committee, and has led or served on many projects. Please welcome Jan, who will introduce our main program.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My LT table over here. Former journalist, University of Washington professor, chair of the Department of Communications, author of 2 books. All of this would describe today's speaker, David Domke. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I first met David about 3 years ago when he came to speak at a Leadership Tomorrow alumni event and touched on some of the similar themes that I think he'll be touching on today. At that event, I remember him saying that when his current term as chair of the Department of Communications at the university ended, he was planning to devote more time to civic engagement, and he wanted to start some kind of organization that would help move the needle forward in that arena. Fast forward to 2 years since then, last September, I ran into an LT alum and friend of mine who told me he'd been spending all of his time in North Carolina working with local groups on voter registration. And I said, that sounded cool. And he said, it's through this Seattle organization called Common Purpose. And it was started by this guy named David Domke, who he had gone on a civil rights pilgrimage with a few months prior. A month after that, I found myself in a Common Purpose workshop. And I signed up to spend a week in Tucson, Arizona, to work with local organizations there to help get the vote out. It was a great experience, and it was a lot better than sitting in front of my TV screaming at it. I tell you this story not to tell you about Common Purpose, but to tell you about David Domke, someone who saw a way to move the needle on civic involvement and actually made it happen. Someone who can see the big picture and make some sense of our current political involvement, and most of all, a committed and passionate servant leader. Everyone, please join me in welcoming David Domke.
Good afternoon. It's an incredible honor to be here. And I choose that word. I'm a communication professor. I choose that word quite intentionally. It really is an honor to have sat at this table, to have heard the conversation, to be part of that conversation. President Moore, new member Raymond, who you should be the speaker today. Yeah. I've been a professor at the University of Washington for 21 years and just recently finished my time there. I'm on leave for a year, but then departing to do civic engagement work because I believe that our country is at a moment of existential peril that is equivalent to December 7th, 1941. And people mobilized then, so I would have the chance to mobilize now. And so I would hope that you would all leave today, whether you agree with everything that I'm going to send your way in the next few minutes, at least recognizing that there are many people, many of whom do not look like me, who face a moment of absolute terror in this moment in our society, and that it's imperative that all of us recognize that and do something about it. So I decided to leave UW to do this work, and I made 2 commitments. I wanted to do a lot of civic work, which you'll hear a little bit about, but I would also wear shorts every day. And so I'm just trying to live out my truth right now, okay? Just trying to live it out. So thank you. So American transformation. I want to talk about voting. It is harder to vote in America today than at any point since 1965, all right? And I want to give a little bit of the rationale for why that is, go quickly through all of this because we don't have a lot of time, and then finish with this organization that's been mentioned, Common Purpose. So I want to start with a quote. It's going to do it. This is just like class at UW. It's going to do it. It's on its way. Perfect. Truth. This is a historian, Rick Downs, who's written about American history and voting at different points in time. And I realize as I'm doing this right now that I can't read you the quote because I can't read the quote, okay? So we're going to have to look at it together. Oh, it's over here. Perfect. So historian Rick Downs wrote this last year. In May of 1862, an enslaved wheelman named Robert Smalls gathered his family and other slaves on board a steamer called the Planter. This is in South Carolina. While the captain and white crew slept on shore, Smalls raised the Confederate stars and bars and sailed past the unsuspecting guard at Fort Sumter. 10 miles off the coast, Smalls turned the Planter, the boat, over to a U.S. clipper ship. Soon he became a celebrity. And thanks to the prize that the U.S. government paid him, he became modestly wealthy. Smalls used his fame to organize freed people to protest segregation and to demand their rights. Let's see, is this going to do it? Great. Smalls' move into politics was part of a vast transformation of American politics. Prior to the Civil War, African American men could only vote in 6 northern states. But the flood of 200,000 black men into the U.S. Army and Navy inspired them and others to claim the vote as their due. Although it took 2 years, congressional Republicans in the Military Reconstruction Acts of 1867 enfranchised African American men in ex-Confederate states, put those states under military supervision, and dispatched generals to enroll black male voters and call elections for delegates to create new state constitutions. In 1867, during what historian Julie Saville has called Registration Summer, hundreds of veterans and activists traveled all through the regions holding meetings. Although freed women could not vote, they lobbied, cajoled, argued, brandished weapons, and even held sex strikes to convince kin and neighbors to register. Registration was their newly acquired badge of citizenship, one government agent said. By the fall of 1867, more than 80% of eligible African American men had registered. During the subsequent elections, at least 75% of black men turned out to vote in 5 southern states. Democracy has a long history, but almost nothing to match this story. Last little bit here. Robert Smalls won a seat in he went back to South Carolina, won a seat in South Carolina's 1868 Constitutional Convention and then in the new state legislature. In conventions and subsequent state legislatures, Smalls and compatriots tore down racial barriers, established public school systems, hospitals, orphanages, and asylums, revised tenancy laws, and tried to promote railroad construction and modernize the economy. Reconstruction governments also provided crucial votes to ratify the 14th Amendment, which is still the foundation of birthright citizenship, school desegregation, protection against state limits on speech or assembly, and the right to gay marriage. But like every revolution, this one inspired a counter-revolution. And that's the take-home message right there. That every revolution inspires a counter-revolution. And it's way easier to read about these revolutions and counter-revolutions historically than to be in the middle of them. And we're in the middle of them. We're in the big-time middle of them right now. Okay? So I'm just going to quick run through some history to give us a sense of what voting in America has looked like historically. At the beginning of the United States, in the U.S. Constitution, there were race and sex barriers built right into the system to voting. Okay? There is nothing at the founding in the Constitution about voting rights, nothing at all. It's left entirely to the states, and so states began to act upon it in ways that they so chose. In most states, it was left to white men to vote, particularly white men with property. National movements in the 1830s towards abolition and towards women's rights began to build a kind of voice, a crescendo around the importance of suffrage for others besides white men. During the war, Civil War, women's rights kind of got pushed to the side, and also some folks willingly let it go to the side. There were some real internal debates and disagreements among leaders in the women's movement. And so by the time we come out of the Civil War, the reality is that women who are having a moment in terms of their own rights and progress, were pushed to the side, and we began to focus on African American men gaining the right to vote post-Civil War, and that became the point of focus. And so in 1869, with the passage of the 15th Amendment adopted by the states in 1870, we have the first time the federal government in the Constitution addresses voting. And in the 15th Amendment, this is the key section, that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged in the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, just to be very clear, this is what legal scholars will call a negatively worded amendment. A positively worded amendment declares what everybody has. A negatively worded amendment says you can't take something away based upon certain reasons. A positively worded amendment could be all American citizens have the right to vote. That could be what it would be, that all adult American citizens have the right to vote. That's not what this says. It says that you cannot deny the right to vote for certain things. So if you're a really creative white supremacist and you see this, what are you going to do? You'll find other ways to deny the right to vote. Okay? This kind of negatively wording, just to give you a sense of its kind of arc in the historical trajectory of this country, becomes the same exact language in the 19th Amendment when women gain the right to vote. It's exactly the same language, except it's modified for sex. You can't take away the right to vote for sex, for someone's birth sex. But you could take it away for other things that might correlate with being a woman in our society. So these are negatively worded amendments. And so what we've done as a society is spent decades and decades finding ways to take away the right to vote. That is the story of America. It is not the only story of America. I'm honored to sing the national anthem. I believe in this country. But it is part of the story of America. So some of the ways that this has occurred is that the Supreme Court in 1876 ruled that Native Americans were not citizens and thus don't have the right to vote. That's not just ironic, okay? It is also has deep societal and psychological implications. In 1882, the Congress and the Chinese Exclusion Act passed to support white Americans on the West Coast, said that no one else could come from China and anybody here from China could never become a citizen. Could not ever become a citizen, and thus couldn't vote. In 1890, in Mississippi, they created a new state constitution which said, okay, so you can be a citizen, but then there's certain things you need to do in order to vote. And the three that become the biggies are called understanding test, the literacy test, and the poll tax. The understanding test and literacy test occurs when a voter registrar says to me, if I want to register to vote, can you explain to me what the second clause of the third article of the Constitution means? And I have to explain it to them. And they get to decide, just like an authoritarian teacher, whether you're right or not. Well, the way they interpreted those question and answers were that white people could do this and black people couldn't. Literacy clause is, can you read it or not? And we're going to give you the toughest things to read. And a poll tax, you ought to be able to pay. You have to pay in order to vote. All of these became what we'll call extra citizenship requirements to vote that were so effective they got adopted all across the South. In 1922, the Supreme Court picks up the Chinese Exclusion Act and adds the same kind of language to Japanese Americans and say, you can't naturalize and become a citizen ever. Eventually, these are going to get changed, but they last for a long, long time. And in 1925, the Congress says that Filipino heritage people in this society can only become citizens if they've done military service. All of these are just the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. It's what I get to tell you in a 23-minute presentation. Okay? So that by the time we get to the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, we have racialized voting in America, such that whites can vote everywhere. Whites can vote everywhere, but in the South, it's only whites and mostly whites. In the North, it can be whites and African Americans, and in the West, it can be whites and whites in the South and the West, whites and blacks in the North. But on the West Coast, particularly where many Asian Americans live, they did not have the right to vote. So this is the reality. This is what it's been for most of American history. for most of American history. All of this changes with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act is a spectacular piece of legislation. It is one of the most impactful, carefully developed, truly effective pieces of legislation. Many historians call it the most important small d democratic piece of legislation this country's ever passed. Just to give you a sense of its scope and its impact, look at these. These are 6 southern states. You don't have to know them all. It's Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on. And I want to show you what percent could vote, registered to vote in 1965, and what percent could vote after a couple decades of the civil rights of the Voting Rights Act. In 1965, the blue line represents what percent of white Americans in those states could vote. And the orange lines represent what percent of black Americans in those states could vote. The smallest one is Mississippi, where some of our greatest civil rights heroes come from, because they experienced this tremendous oppression. One of the arguments made by white Americans is that black people didn't want to right the vote. They didn't care. So they went to great lengths to prove that they did care. And in 2004, when we look at the numbers, we actually see that these folks look pretty similar. Given the right to vote, of course they and everybody who has a chance. It is the predominant fundamental right of this country to participate in our democracy, to at least cast a vote. I use these data in 1965 and 2004 because they are used in a court decision that comes out in 2013, the Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, in which the Supreme Court of the United States rules that one section, a key section of the Voting Rights Act, is unconstitutional. Just guts it, absolutely guts it. And John Roberts writes the court decision in this in a 5-4 decision. In the key paragraph in Roberts' decision, he says, things have changed dramatically since 1965. I need glasses. Yet the act has not eased Section 5's restrictions. I just don't have time to explain all that, but that's an important piece of the act. Has not eased Section 5's restrictions or narrowed the scope of Section 4's coverage formula along the way. Basically, he's saying you haven't updated this. Instead, those extraordinary, unprecedented features have been reauthorized as if nothing has changed, and they have grown even stronger. Our country has changed. And while any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes to remedy that problem speaks to current conditions. It's an incredibly important court decision. Thank you very much. Incredibly important, and I'll take Roberts at his word. He says it should speak to current conditions. In a dissent, Ruth Bader Ginsburg I mean, you might agree with her politics or her positions, but just as a human being, she's incredible, right? Just as a pure human. I love that her and Scalia were best pals, right? If that isn't a model for us, then I don't know what is. Aren't we all Rotarians? I'm just, okay, so Ginsburg writes a dissent. She says, my colleague John Roberts is correct. America has changed. And the reason it's changed is because of laws like the Voting Rights Act. And if you take away that law, we're going to go back to where we were. And she uses an analogy of this, of an umbrella in a rainstorm. And she says, to get rid of the Voting Rights Act when you're dry is to assume that in the middle of a rainstorm, because you're dry, you can get rid of the thing that made you dry and you'll still stay dry. Would you stand in the middle of a rainstorm and be dry from an umbrella and say, I'm dry, I can get rid of it? And she pointed to the thousands of times that the Department of Justice, since the Voting Rights Act, literally thousands of times, had blocked a variety of discriminatory laws going into place across this country, many in the South, but not all, that the Voting Rights Act had prevented from being passed. And she said, we are going to revert, okay? So I tend to depress people when I talk, but I won't end there, I promise. But the reality is that she's absolutely correct. And so The second part of my talk is to give a sense of what is the scale of what we'll call voter suppression in America. It's not voter disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement is that you cannot vote at all. You're intimidated through violence or laws prevent you. Voter suppression is to make it harder to vote. You can still do it, but it's way, way harder to do it. You can do it, but it's going to take everything you got. So our current conditions, to use the language of Roberts, can be simplified in this visual image of the United States continental U.S. Every state in red that I'm about to show you has passed laws since 2011 that have made it harder to vote. Harder to vote. 23 states since 2011 have passed laws that made it harder to vote. Roughly a third of these passed these the day after the Shelby County decision. They had the laws ready to go, and they enacted them the day after. This is states that have made it harder to vote. What does that look like? I'm going to give you some examples. One thing is proof of ID laws. Everybody's got to show a voter identification law to vote. On principle, this sounds just fine. Shouldn't we have to show ID just like we have to have a driver's license or to buy medicine? Shouldn't we have to show ID? I would be with you. If a national ID was provided to every single person in this country, I'm with you. But that isn't the way it works. National IDs are not provided to everybody. We don't have such a thing. And so states by states decide what voter IDs count. In Texas, a gun license ID counts, a college ID does not. In the state of Missouri, where the students at the University of Missouri protested racial discrimination historically at the University of Missouri, the Missouri legislature responded by removing college IDs as a legitimate voter ID. They responded this way. So we don't have a system that is consistent in this way. We have an unequal system where in certain states it can pass if you have certain IDs, in other states it doesn't. We have complicated voter registrations. It's not easy to register to vote in most states. It's very complicated. In fact, it's threatening to many people. They feel that the government's going to not only get them to register to vote, they're going to show up at their doors. Okay? We can close DMV offices where most people register to vote. Across the South, DMV offices get closed in rural counties all the time. And people's, certain leadership's response is, you can just drive 40 miles, 50 miles. No, you actually can't if you don't have a car, if you don't have time, you don't have money. It isn't that easy. We can reduce the number of voting places. The percentage, a per capita number of people living in urban cities in our society who have voting booths relative to the number of voting booths in rural areas is about a difference of 10 to 1. So many more in urban areas. You're far more likely to have to wait. It also so happens to correlate with the fact that people of color live in urban areas. So you wipe out voting booths, this matters. In Florida, they took all voting booths off of college campuses. Just said, no, we shouldn't have them. You can reduce voting windows, cut back the amount of time you can vote. One of the major targets is to remove voting on weekends, when, again, people who have jobs who can't make time to vote on a Tuesday would go vote. You remove it. In North Carolina, they did this with what the courts have said is surgical precision targeted to African Americans to remove their ability to vote. They cut back to certain days of the week and weekends. Finally, last one, purging of voter rolls. What a voter roll is a long list of people are identified as voters. And when you show up to vote in most states, not in this state, but in most states, you have to go to a place to vote. And you show up and you say, I'm so-and-so, and you either show your ID or not show your ID. And they cross-check it with a list. That list is a voter roll. It says you're a registered voter. You can vote. If your name's on that list, you can cast a regular vote. If your name's not on that list, you get to cast what's called a absentee or a provisional ballot. Those ballots are only counted if the election is close. The Supreme Court 2 years ago ruled that you could purge people off of voter rolls if they haven't voted within the last couple elections in any state. States get that call. In Ohio, there's a big lawsuit right now because they were about to purge hundreds of thousands of voters, but there are lots of mistakes on those voter rolls. So the ACLU, Jeffrey Robinson was here, is one of the key litigants against that, about blocking that. Okay, I'm not even going to put it on the list, the one that sits very strong right now, which is called lifetime disfranchisement for felonies. That the reality is that when you commit a felony, you're often disfranchised either for life or for long periods of your life in our country. So voter suppression exists everywhere, unfortunately. It exists too many places. And you might feel it in my voice, the zeal of an evangelist about this. That's because for much of my life, I didn't understand or believe this. And I'm a professor, and I teach about American politics. And I thought this was overblown. It's not actually. It's just overblown when you look like me. All right? That's a privileged space I operated within. And so the reality is that it's time to do everything we can about this body of work. This is a Brennan Center, based at New York City's conclusion about those laws, okay? They did a little bit of studies about all these laws. Partisanship played a key role. Of 23 states with new restrictions, 18 were passed by entirely Republican-controlled legislatures. I'll skip down. Race was also a significant factor. Of the 11 states with the highest African-American turnout in 2008, 7 have new restrictions since 2010. Of the 12 states with the largest Hispanic growth, 2000-2010, 9 passed laws making it harder to vote. Race is a factor. All of these are realities. I believe in facts. These are facts. Okay? So I'm coming into the last bit now, democracy. I recommend a book titled When Democracies Die. It's a cheery book. No, actually, that was a joke. The reality is actually it is a very uplifting book. It's about how democracies don't die. And I want to just read one quote from this from Stephen Levitsky. Comparing our current predicament to democratic crises in other parts of the world and at other moments of history, it becomes clear that America is not so different from other nations. Our constitutional system, while older and more robust than any in history, is vulnerable to the same pathologies that have killed democracy elsewhere. Ultimately, then, American democracy depends on us, the citizens of the United States. No single political leader can end a democracy. No single leader can rescue one either. Democracy is a shared enterprise. Its fate depends on all of us. So, a couple years ago, and I'm joined by a couple colleagues today, we created an organization called Common Purpose. It runs like this, from one side to the other. We want to take people, your people, and we want to put them into positions where they can voter register and voter mobilize. We run you through a little set of workshops and opportunities like this. It has 4 pillars to it. We build community. We identify locations we want to work. We build teams, and then we go and do field work and we learn about this. We've done this. Hundreds of people have participated. It's led by diverse peoples, particularly younger and rising leaders. It's an organization that not only does civic action, it builds our next generation of leadership. On your tables is a flyer about Common Purpose. Would love to have your engagement and participation and interest. Would love to have you come and talk to my colleagues Charles Douglas and Maria Bando and me at the end of today. You are leaders. That's what this room is. I know I need to get off the stage. But like I told Governor Howard Dean in 2004 when he was waiting for me to get off the stage, there are some things that the moment is here. We need to act. I would be honored if you would use your positions of leadership to help save this democracy. Thank you.